January 1066. A frost has arrived that chills the very soul of England, turning the breath of kings and peasants alike into fleeting ghosts. The king is dead. His crown sits on a cold stone table in Westminster, unclaimed, vibrating with the silent panic of advisors who know that by dawn, the world they know will be gone. There is no heir, only a vacuum of power and a series of whispered promises that contradict one another in the dark, wax-scented corridors. The oxygen is leaving the room. This is not a transition. It is a countdown to a collision that will erase the identity of an entire people. The shadow of the sword is already lengthening across the map, and the first hand to seize the gold will either save a kingdom or ignite a funeral pyre. Harold Godwinson stands in the flickering shadows of the council chamber, the crushing expectation of the English nobility pressing upon his shoulders. He is the strongest man in the room, a seasoned leader with the blood of the land in his veins. Yet he is haunted by a ghost from across the sea. They say he is a perjurer. They say that years ago, shipwrecked and desperate, he laid his hand on holy relics and swore to support another man's claim. That man, William of Normandy, watches the horizon with eyes that never blink. To take the crown is to invite a charge of treason against the divine. To refuse it is to leave the gates of England wide open for anyone with a blade and a fleet. When the gold is finally lowered onto Harold's head, it does not feel like a symbol of authority. It feels like a target painted on his chest, a heavy, cold circle of iron and light. Across the English Channel, the news arrives not as a surprise, but as a calculated catalyst for fury. William of Normandy does not see a new king. He sees a thief who has stolen a promised inheritance. William is a man forged in the furnace of survival, having spent his youth dodging the knives of treacherous barons in the dark of night. He understands that legitimacy is not something you are born with. It is something you manufacture with iron and defend with blood. He begins to assemble an army of opportunists, knights and believers, all drawn by the promise of land and the chilling blessing of a distant pope. This is the slow-motion tightening of a noose. The Norman shipyards hum with the sound of saws and hammers, a rhythmic drumming that echoes the heartbeat of an impending invasion. It is a relentless pulse of when, not if, echoing across the gray waters. While the south prepares for a Norman storm, a different shadow stretches over the north. The North Sea is churning, turning a bruised purple as the Viking Age prepares for its final, desperate gasp. Harald Hardrada, a giant of a man whose name translates to hard ruler, has arrived with a fleet of 300 ships. Beside him stands Tostig, King Harold's own vengeful brother, a man who would rather see his country burn than see his brother rule it. England is a house divided, being pulled from both ends by predators who can smell the weakness of a contested throne. Harold Godwinson finds himself in a desperate race against geography. He looks at his maps and sees the impossible. A fire in the north that must be extinguished, and a predator in the south that refuses to wait for the smoke to clear. The march north is a blur of mud, sweat, and the clanking of mail. Harold pushes his men to the breaking point, covering 200 miles in a mere 4 days, a feat that defies the logic of the age. They arrive at Stamford Bridge like a whirlwind, catching the Vikings off guard in the morning mist. The air fills with the copper tang of blood and the screams of men who thought the age of shield walls was their eternal birthright. In the cold northern air, the clash of steel marks the end of an era. The giant of the north falls, his throat pierced by an arrow, and the Viking threat is extinguished in a slaughter so absolute that of the 300 ships that arrived, only 24 are needed to carry the survivors home. But there is no time to breathe, no time to bury the dead. As the dust settles over the northern fields, a messenger arrives, his horse lathered in foam, his eyes wide with terror. The words are a death knell. The wind has shifted. The Norman fleet has landed at Pevensey. The king must now turn his weary, depleted army around and march back the way they came. The physical toll is unimaginable. Boots are worn through, feet are bleeding, and the mental exhaustion of a sudden victory is replaced by the crushing dread of a second invasion. They march another 200 miles, moving like ghosts through a landscape that feels increasingly alien and hostile. Harold knows his men are spent, but he cannot wait. Every hour he delays is an hour William uses to fortify his position, to burn English villages, and to bait the king into a final confrontation. The crown is now a physical burden, and Harold is climbing a mountain of his own making, haunted by the memory of the brother he just left rotting in the mud of the north. On October 14th, the sun rises over the hill of Senlac near Hastings, casting long, distorted shadows that look like reaching fingers. The two forces stare at each other across a narrow valley. The English hold the high ground, a solid wall of shields, interlocking like the scales of a great serpent. They are tired, their breath hitching in the cold air, but they are defending their homes. Below them, the Normans are a mosaic of colorful banners and polished mail, a professional force of archers and mounted knights. William knows that a direct assault on a shield wall is a gamble with the highest stakes. If he fails here, there is no retreat. The sea is behind him, and a hostile kingdom lies ahead. He looks up at the English line and sees not just an army, but a barrier between him and a destiny he believes was written in the stars. The morning begins with the rhythmic drumming of axes against shields, a sound that vibrates in the marrow of the bone. Then comes the high-pitched whistle of arrows. The Norman archers fire uphill, but the English shields hold firm, catching the shafts like a forest floor catching rain. The tension is a physical presence, a cord stretched to its breaking point. William sends his infantry forward, then his cavalry, but they are repelled by the sheer density of the English line. For hours, the two sides are locked in a grim stalemate. The hill becomes a place where time slows down, where the only reality is the sound of wood splintering, the heavy breathing of men who have forgotten the feeling of safety, and the smell of churned earth and horse sweat. Then, a rumor begins to ripple through the Norman ranks, cold and paralyzing. The word spreads that William has fallen. Panic, the great destroyer of armies, starts to take hold. Men begin to turn, their formation fracturing as they seek the safety of the rear. Seeing the opportunity, segments of the English line break their discipline. They surge down the hill, chasing the retreating Normans, sensing that the day is won. They abandon the protection of the shield wall, their bloodlust overriding their training. This is the moment where the world tilts. William removes his helmet, riding along his line to show his face to his men. He is not a ghost. He is the architect of this moment. He screams at his fleeing troops, rallying them, and realizes that the English mistake is the crack in the armor he has been waiting for. The retreat was a moment of weakness that William instantly transforms into a calculated deception. He orders his cavalry to wheel around and strike the English who have left the safety of the heights. Without the protection of the shield wall, the English are vulnerable, caught in the open like sheep among wolves. The hill, once an impregnable fortress, begins to bleed its defenders. William repeats the strategy, feigning retreats to draw more and more of Harold's men into the killing floor of the valley. The discipline of the English housecarls remains, but the gaps in their line are growing wider. The sun begins to dip lower in the sky, casting a blood-red light across the field, as if the landscape itself is mourning the loss of the old world. In the fading light, the focus shifts to the center of the English line, where Harold stands beneath his standard. The Norman archers are ordered to change their trajectory, firing high into the air so that the arrows fall vertically onto the heads of the defenders. It is a rain of iron that cannot be blocked by shields held to the front. Somewhere in this storm of projectiles, the momentum of history shifts forever. A sudden sharp cry rises from the English center. The king is struck. The shield wall, the symbol of Anglo-Saxon defiance for centuries, finally begins to crumble under the relentless hooves of the Norman knights. The coordination of the defense snaps, and the individual soldiers find themselves alone in a sea of Norman blades. As dusk settles, the formation shatters into 1,000 individual struggles. The Normans pour over the ridge, their horses finding purchase on the blood-slicked grass. The English housecarls, the elite guard of the king, refuse to flee. They stand their ground around the spot where their leader fell, a final, silent protest against the turning of the tide. They fight until the last man, not for a kingdom they can still save, but for a code of loyalty that is dying with them. By the time the moon rises, the silence over the field of Hastings is absolute, broken only by the scavenging of crows and the low moans of the dying. The era of the Anglo-Saxons has ended in the dark, and a new, colder reality has taken its place. William, now the Conqueror, looks out over the landscape he has won. It is a kingdom of ruins and orphans, a land that will take generations to forget the sound of his horses. He does not celebrate with the warmth of a liberator. He prepares for the cold administration of a victor. He knows that a crown won by the sword must be kept by the stone. He will build great square towers of rock, the White Tower of London, to remind the people who now holds the keys to their future. He will commission a great survey, a book of judgment that tracks every ox, every acre, and every soul, ensuring that nothing, not even a blade of grass, escapes his reach. The freedom of the old laws is being replaced by the rigid structure of a new continental order. The transition is a slow, agonizing process of erasure. In the years that follow, the north of England will feel the full weight of William's shadow. Any spark of resistance is met with a systematic silencing of the countryside, a period of hardship that leaves the earth scarred and the villages empty. The old nobility is stripped of its titles, replaced by Norman lords who speak a different tongue and build their homes high above the people they rule. The very language begins to shift, a blend of harsh northern tones and the fluid grace of the French court, creating a new tongue born out of conflict. The identity of the nation is being rewritten in real time, carved into the stone of the cathedrals and the parchment of the new laws. History remembers 1066 as a date of triumph for some and tragedy for others. But for those who lived through it, it was a period of profound uncertainty. The ghosts of the fallen at Stamford Bridge and Hastings haunt the foundations of the country. The crown, once a symbol of a people's consensus, became a symbol of a singular, uncompromising will. The tension between the ruler and the ruled, the invader and the native, became the DNA of a new nation, forged in the heat of a year that refused to end quietly. The survival of England was no longer about preserving the past, but about enduring a future that had been imposed upon it from across the sea. The legacy of William is written in the white stone of his fortresses and the uncompromising lines of the Doomsday Book. It is a legacy of control, of a map redrawn by the edge of a sword and the stroke of a pen. England was no longer an island apart. It was now inextricably linked to the bloodlines and the constant warfare of Europe. The price of this integration was the loss of 1,000 years of history, replaced by a narrative written by those who survived the hill at Hastings. The thriller of 1066 did not end when the crown was placed on William's head on Christmas Day. It merely moved into the halls of power, where the whispers of the past continued to echo against the new stone walls. Even today, the landscape of the country bears the subtle marks of that October day. The names of the towns, the structure of the law, and the very way the English speak are all echoes of a struggle that took place when the stakes were everything. We look back at Harold and William not as heroes or villains, but as men caught in the gears of a changing world, each believing they were the rightful stewards of a destiny that was never truly theirs to keep. The crown remains, but the heads that wore it are long since dust, leaving only the story of a year when the wind changed and the world tilted on its axis. As the final light fades from this history, we are left with the image of a lone campfire on a hill, the embers glowing like the eyes of a predator. The conquest was not just a battle. It was a psychological shift that redefined what it meant to belong to a land. The fear of the unknown, the threat of the horizon, and the cost of an oath broken. These are the shadows that 1066 left behind. The story of the Norman conquest is a reminder that the stability of a nation can vanish in a single season, leaving only the cold, hard truth of who is left standing when the sun finally sets. The crown is heavy, the stone is cold, and the countdown to the next collision is always running in the silence between the heartbeats of history.